Good afternoon. My name is Harriet Auty. I'm a veterinary epidemiologist at SIUC up in Inverness. And I'm going to talk today about risk assessment, which looks like it's just flowing seamlessly from the discussions that we just had, which I think was deliberate. Yes, it was. I've been working on EPIC since 2011, and in that time we've been involved in a number of different risk assessments, and really for quite a range of purposes, for different pathogens, for different timescales, from risk assessments needed within kind of 3 hours up to things that have taken a year or more. And to give you some examples of the specific risk assessments that we've been involved in, risk assessment was actually one of the first kind of policy-linked areas of work that Lisa and myself were both involved in. When we started in 2011, this was an area of work that really gave us a chance to, I suppose, to build relationships and to develop and explore the way that we interacted with our policy colleagues at Scottish Government. And this first piece of work was to develop a library of risk assessments for use during an outbreak of foot and mouth disease in two particular areas. The first about recreational access to the countryside, and secondly, risk assessments to back up licenses for things like movements and activities that are needed quite urgently in an outbreak situation. So, for example, if you've got a dairy farm where cows have got to cross a public road in order to get to a milking parlour, they can't wait. That needs to happen on the first day, but that's a movement that has to be licensed. And this is an action that resulted from a recommendation in the Scudamore Review of Foot and Mouth in 2007 to have this library of risk assessments that would be there, created in peacetime and ready for an outbreak situation. So this was a substantial piece of work that took over a year, and we worked closely with both Scottish Government and with APHA as well. As you've heard, and there'll be more talks about avian influenza, over the last year or so we've been involved in a number of avian influenza risk assessments, including things like risks of incursion to Scotland, effects of poultry and things like gatherings. And these have all been rapid risk assessments where something is needed very quickly to make a decision, including potentially decisions within kind of needing a risk assessment in 3 hours because the Minister was going to make a decision that afternoon. EPIC's also been involved in a number of kind of general incursion risk assessments. EPIC staff will work closely with APHA on things like risk of blue tongue entry to the UK. And some of the risk assessments that we've worked on have originated from questions from industry. So over the last year we've been working on one to do with movement of eggs between source farms and hatcheries. And we've developed a template that we use. It's evolved a little bit over time as we've improved it, but we now have a consistent template that we use so that people using these risk assessments know what to expect and they can easily find the information they're looking for. So including sections at the beginning which summarise the outcomes essentially, so the likelihood, the consequences and the risk estimates, and specifically the uncertainty measures that go with them. Any relevant legislation, definitions or assumptions that need pointing out up front, hazard identification and a clearly stated risk question, risk pathways, usually set out as a figure, as many pathways as are needed, and then for each step in each risk pathway, a discussion of risk factors influencing the likelihood of that step, an estimate of that likelihood, and explicitly any uncertainties or knowledge gaps or assumptions that are made. Consequence assessment is usually a bit more discussive, and then we can add in additional sections if anything's needed for things like additional mitigation measures. And although the timescale often varies on these things, generally it's the same sort of pathway through EPIC. So EPIC receives a request from Scottish Government. Risk assessments are normally led by T1. So our short name for T1, everyone will be pleased to hear, is Policy, Preparedness and Public Engagement, I think, maybe not in that order. So we have got preparedness in there. And then T1 brings in expertise from other parts of EPIC as we need to. We would develop a risk question and a pathway At that point, it would be a very iterative process going back to Scottish Government and potentially other people if they're involved, like industry, in order to end up with a risk question and a pathway that everybody is happy with. At that point, we would then develop and populate the risk assessment, and then there'd be another step of feedback again with Scottish Government and with potentially other stakeholders at that point. Risk assessments are usually reviewed within EPIC. At this stage, it gives us another opportunity to use other expertise within EPIC. And depending on the timescale, might also undergo a formal review process. So, for example, the risk assessments of foot and mouth disease that I was talking about at the beginning were reviewed by the National Experts Group on Foot and Mouth Disease. Risk assessments are submitted to Scottish Government and usually are predominantly put up online. And if these are longer term risk assessments, they might also have a regular review process to keep them up to date. So what I want to talk about today is really what are the challenges that we've come across in terms of developing these risk assessments and using this as a route of providing evidence for policy. And I know this isn't necessarily the most interesting subject, so I'm going to try and keep it interesting. I've divided it into 3 areas, and I'm going to identify several questions to think about. And just to say, I think we've got a model that works very well at the moment. This is a tried and tested model. We've successfully been producing risk assessments that have been used for a number of years. So we're not saying that this is all wrong and we want to throw it out, but just to raise some questions to think about of how we might be able to improve this process further. And in particular, we're having a workshop in a few weeks' time with the people responsible for the risk assessment process in the other administrations within the UK. So I hope that some of the things that are raised here will give us interesting points for discussion at that workshop as well. So I'll try not to let you get too bored, and I'll give you some questions to think about as we go through. Just to say, I didn't actually choose my talk title, but so I'll start with the what. So what are we talking about when we're talking about risk assessments? Well, risk assessments are used when we need a very transparent, objective and defensible approach. And the methodology was really originally developed for having defensible agreements for intercountry trade. And often risk assessments are just required as part of a formal governance process. For example, EU would require risk assessments to back up a lot of decisions during an outbreak. Within the UK, there's really, I suppose I've divided it into 3 categories of risk assessments that we might think of. So firstly, APHA would make on-the-ground operational decisions based on risk assessments. These are performed by vets within APHA. They're quite context-specific, so they often apply to licensing a movement or an activity for one specific farm during an outbreak. Decisions about outbreak control measures, more tactical decisions, these are risk assessments that are made usually by epidemiologists who are at least partially embedded within policy. These are things that require quick decisions for quick risk assessments for tactical decisions. And so this would also include things like the disease incursion risks, where some action might be required, whether it's a change in trade arrangements or a change in focus of surveillance in order to improve the disease situation. And thirdly, there are risk assessments that might be a more substantial risk question, and then more strategic risk assessments, maybe about future decisions on how a disease might be managed, or things to do with, say, trade or wildlife. So then more detailed assessments have a longer timescale. And there's obviously a gradient from the ones at the top, which are very specific, very context-driven, and have very information which is very much on the ground information, through to the more strategic ones, where information is going to be more generic, more applicable to different situations, rely more on published information, and also potentially be more publishable and take more time to complete. And the ones that I'm talking about today really are the tactical and the strategic ones that EPIC is involved in. So the aim of a risk assessment is generally to review the existing information in order to answer a specific question. And the language of risk assessment does tend to be, well, it has to be quite precise. verging on the pedantic. And the exact scope and the remit of the risk question is really important. And some risk questions are quite obvious and quite easy to develop, and some of them are really quite challenging. And some of the ones that I think we found hardest have been the ones where it's perhaps more about a comparison of potential policies. I think they're difficult because they tend to touch not just on disease and disease spread and perhaps the things that we're most familiar with, but tend to have much wider implications that need to be considered. And I mean, we resolve that usually by working closely with colleagues in Scottish Government or APHA to make sure that we understand, but often it requires quite a detailed understanding of the existing mitigation measures or what could be put in place to make sure that we fully understand the implications. There's also a bit of a balance in terms of developing a good risk question. So it's quite easy to develop a strong question for a risk assessment that doesn't necessarily address the policy need which Scottish Government are asking for. And vice versa, it's quite easy to develop something which addresses policy really well, but is quite a difficult question to ask in a risk assessment. And I think in general within EPIC, we've erred towards trying to answer the useful policy questions, but sometimes that's made our risk assessments quite hard to write. So one of the questions I'm going to throw out is just, do we need to be clearer about what is an appropriate risk question? So moving on to the who should be involved both with developing and with using these risk assessments? So the way that the risk assessment process usually works within EPIC, as I mentioned, is that Lisa and I, who sit within T1, we're both veterinary epidemiologists, and we play, I guess, a knowledge broker role to an extent between policy and the scientists within EPIC. So we would normally kind of lead on a risk assessment, and then we'd be using expertise from within EPIC to help us. And that might be specific to a particular pathogen. For example, Paul Bessel's been involved with a lot on blue tongue and Schmallenberg, or it might be for a specific sector. So Nick Sparks is extremely patient with Lisa and I asking him questions about poultry. But there's a lot of expertise within EPIC. There's a lot of people within EPIC. And could we be using that expertise more in our risk assessment process? So as an example, if we're completing a risk step in a pathway that considers the likelihood of farmers complying with a particular mitigation measure, should we be involving social and behavioural scientists or economists in helping us fill out that risk pathway? Or does involving more disciplines actually change the inherent nature of a risk assessment? And if we are doing that and making more interdisciplinary risk assessments, do we need to have a better understanding of the full policy context? Because we're likely then to be touching on wider areas than perhaps we have done in the past. So for some areas of risk analysis, the roles of risk assessment and risk management are kept completely separate. So there's a quote here from the European Food Safety Authority: risk assessors provide independent scientific advice, risk managers use this advice, and at a European level, this separation of roles is fundamental and enshrined in law. It was introduced to make clear the distinction between science and politics, to place independent science-based assessment at the heart of policy making. Well, I don't think we'd disagree with the placing independent science-based assessment at the heart of policy making, but it isn't the only way to do things. There's a quote here from FAO saying risk assessment is best carried out by the Central Epidemiology Unit. Risk management and risk communication are tasks for everyone and should be coordinated by the CVO. So just to give a couple of examples, this is from Veterinary Surveillance Strategy Report in 2011. I'm sorry, it's a cloud of acronyms, but really just wanted to illustrate that on the left in the hazard identification, there's a whole series of different institutions involved essentially in surveillance. The risk management to the right is predominantly kind of government departments, and the risk assessors in the middle has a lot of the same groups in there, but that doesn't necessarily mean they haven't got separate departments doing different roles. And just out of interest, EPIC is in as a risk manager, because a lot of the work EPIC does is essentially about assessing risk management options. This is from 2011, so it's a reflection of EPIC 1 back in the mists of time, and I think now we'd certainly argue we'd be in the middle column as well. And as another example, This is from Rowena Cosmider and colleagues' paper that came out earlier this year about identifying new animal-related risks, showing risk management teams going through an objective process to assess risks and then feeding them back into the risk group, so a more integrated setup between assessment and management. So I just gave those examples really to help think about where EPIC sits in this role. Is EPIC's role specifically within risk assessment? And again, if we're touching on risk management, which I think we do because we do quite a lot on risk mitigation and, for example, compliance to mitigation measures, but then in that case, how much do we need to understand about the policy context, and do we understand enough? And finally, on who, the point of using risk assessment is to make a very transparent process and to make sure that stakeholders can understand how decisions have been made. And this quote from FAO, I think, illustrates it nicely, saying that stakeholders need to feel comfortable that no unnecessarily risks have been taken and that risk management, any costs associated with risk management are worthwhile. And the particular reason for that transparency is that we're often making decisions without all of the information that we would really like to have. So the OIE says transparency is essential because the data are often uncertain or incomplete, and without full documentation, the distinction between the facts and the analyst's value judgments may blur. And I think historically risk assessments have been done within government and kept there, but now all of our risk assessments more or less go online, and in the days of more transparent governance, it's much easier for people, stakeholders, the public to access this information. But do we write these documents any differently if they're available to this general public, or should we be doing? And do stakeholders actually feel like this process is more transparent? One of the reasons that the foot and mouth risk assessments we talked about at the beginning were all put online was to enable farmers to be able to access those and to understand what movements would be permitted at different stages of an outbreak, so that they could actually be able to do kind of on-farm contingency planning. But it would be interesting to know how many farmers are aware of that or have actually looked at those. I'm almost finished because Thibaut's looking at me. But so last point, which is how do we produce risk assessments that are the most useful? And what I'm just going to briefly consider is how consistent we think our approaches need to be. And given that we're doing risk assessments at the moment between different administrations in the UK, how similar are they at the moment? So this is just a quick comparison between, this is particularly for rapid risk assessments in an outbreak, between those that EPIC has been involved in and those from APHA. And I know it doesn't quite look like it, but actually there are many more similarities than there are differences. We're really using the same methodology and absolutely the same approach. We use the same risk levels and definitions. Some minor differences, I think, predominantly arise from the fact that EPIC isn't embedded in a policy situation. So APHA has easier access and more timely access, given this is in an outbreak situation and could be changing day to day, about the background information about the disease scenario, the surveillance, and easier access to expert opinion through things like the national experts groups. Compared to EPIC, I think we tend to rely more on published literature. And just from a presentation point of view, APHA's sort of template tends to be more discursive, whereas we quite like our tables in EPIC. So I think the vast, our approaches are really very consistent, but there can be small differences in how things are presented. And I think one of the things that often can make it look like we're presenting different answers are just minor things like whether we present risk levels incorporating mitigation measures and things like that or not. So there may be value in exploring some aspects of more consistent approaches that would make it easier for stakeholders to interpret things where they may not be fully familiar with the sort of very pedantic language of risk assessments. So those are the 5 questions that I've put out. Very happy to discuss these at any point. There may be things in here that might come up in the panel discussion. If we don't get a chance to talk about these now, then I hope that anyone here who is involved at that workshop later in the year, that we might be able to explore some of these then. And just thank you particularly to our colleagues at Scottish Government and also APHA, who we worked with a lot on these risk assessments. And I couldn't quite bring myself to do the whole talk without a single picture of any animals. So here's some pigs.